You might think you know everything there is to know about Henry VIII. You'll know he married 6 times and had 2 of his wives executed. But the truth about our most famous king is much more complex and far more compelling. This series tells Henry's story over 6 of the most tumultuous decades in English history, separating the real man from the myth. To some, Henry was a cruel bully.
He wanted the theatre of punishment to be perfect. This is what happens when you defy Henry. This is what traitors get.
To others, he was a charismatic and successful ruler.
He jousts, he rides, he sings. What more could you want from this perfect prince?
But Henry's personality, his innermost thoughts and his motivations have remained elusive.
When somebody is no longer useful to him, that's it, he cuts them out. It's almost pathological.
Once Henry has his mind set on an idea, he will stick with it no matter the consequences.
Now a team of Tudor experts have come together to investigate who the real Henry was.
Here are Henry's insecurities written in black and white.
They'll unearth never-before-seen documents, including some from the Vatican's archives.
Thank you so much for showing me one of the greatest prizes in Tudor history.
And they'll go backstage at Henry's court to unravel a murky world of power, plots, and petrifying ambition.
Henry VIII comes down on opponents with murderous force.
Henry's growing increasingly paranoid. He's starting to lose his grip on reality.
Henry has got older, he's got more tyrannical, his reign has got bloodier, and he is more determined than ever to get his own way.
Henry VIII is now 41 years old. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, has failed to provide him with a longed-for son and heir. And he's becoming increasingly anxious about the future of his dynasty. He's banished Catherine from court and is embroiled in an attempt to divorce her and marry his long-term mistress, Anne Boleyn.
The way in which Henry is treating the 2 women in his life could not be more different. On the one hand, you have this great chivalrous love play with Anne Boleyn, and on the other, there is the incredibly cruel, heartless rejection of Catherine of Aragon, the wife who served him loyally for more than 20 years.
It's interesting to think what it was about Anne Boleyn that made her so attractive to Henry, but also so enigmatically attractive to so many people. Her education in France may have been a factor. She had a style and a glamour that other people didn't. But also her intelligence, her ability to argue with scholars and theologians about religious and moral issues. Henry, the scholar who flattered himself as being the philosopher prince, saw in her, I think, a consort who shared some of those values.
But as their relationship develops, Anne puts pressure on Henry by refusing to sleep with him until their wedding is in sight.
Her own sister had been discarded as Henry's mistress. She wanted more for herself than that. She wanted to be queen. So for 7 long years, she keeps him at arm's length, giving him a little bit of encouragement, and then destroying his hopes the next. That speaks volumes about just how much Henry was enthralled to Anne.
Henry's love letters reveal his obsession with Anne. They survive to this day and are held deep within the Vatican library.
Regina, thank you so much for allowing us to film here and for showing me what has to be one of the greatest prizes in Tudor history. These are the original letters from Henry VIII to his great love, Anne Boleyn.
You're very welcome, and we are happy to show people in Great Britain these documents are precious to you and to us, and precious for, I think, all mankind.
Henry's letters are written in French, the language of courtly love, and are filled with romantic gestures.
You can see there in French, "To my mistress," there at
Mistress.
the top of the page.
He wishes.
And, you know, he talks about being struck by the dart of love or dart d'amour. Now, this is very famous, isn't it? The love heart. It's very romantic that he draws a love heart around Anne's initials,
Yes.
and then either side are his own initials. And even though we don't have Anne's responses, we can sense that she's the one in control, because it's all Henry making the effort and trying to woo her.
Yes.
And she's remaining just out of reach, which I think was part of her genius, actually.
The letters demonstrate just how desperate Henry is. The longer Anne holds him off, the more insecure he becomes.
This is probably my favourite of the letters, because I think it's the most revealing of Henry's state of mind. You sense his insecurity in a way, because he talks of how he's been in a great agony since receiving Anne's last letter, not knowing how to interpret it. Here is a man who has showered his love with affection, with letters, with gifts. He's had very little back. One of the naughtiest letters in the whole collection is this one here, where you really get a sense of Henry's frustrated lust. He writes to Anne, "Wishing myself especially of an evening in my sweetheart's arms, whose pretty duckies or breasts I long to kiss." It's really quite saucy. Here's a man in torture through this unrequited love. Anne's not giving him much back. Henry doesn't know where he stands, and it's sending him crazy.
Anne Boleyn's behaviour and the desire for a male heir have provoked Henry into making one of the most monumental decisions in English history: breaking with the Roman Catholic Church. Eventually, free from the Pope's authority, Henry divorces Catherine of Aragon and marries Anne Boleyn. But all of this comes at the highest imaginable price.
Henry's break with Rome was probably the most devastating political and religious and social event for 500 years. I mean, suddenly to decide that England was not part of Catholic Christendom, to reject the authority of the Pope and everything that that represented, was something which disoriented, terrified everyone. The nation was traumatized.
Henry then declares himself head of his own Church of England.
For Henry to claim to be the head of the church was unprecedented. It's very hard to imagine the radical, shocking nature of that claim. A layman, not someone trained in the church, not a bishop, not someone in holy orders.
Henry believes this makes him second only to God.
On the one hand, you need to have quite a big ego to deal with that. On the other hand, it's a great deal of responsibility. Henry, who is already trying to manage a kingdom, is now trying to manage a church as well. So at the point that Henry breaks with Rome, I don't think anybody quite knows what is going to happen next.
Henry might have got his wish to marry Anne Boleyn, but this revolutionary decision is about to catapult England into chaos and damage Henry's reputation with his people. England is in turmoil after Henry's decision to break with Rome. But despite opposition, he is now ruthlessly forcing the new religion on his Catholic people. To push his religious revolution through, he has a secret weapon in the form of his new chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell.
Thomas Cromwell is nothing less than a genius, talented lawyer. He's a property developer, a moneylender, a trader.
But Cromwell is very different to the noblemen that Henry's surrounded by.
Thomas Cromwell was the son of a lowly person in Putney, just down the river from London. And he had this unique ability to annoy people, particularly the rich nobility of Old England, who regarded him as a common upstart because he wasn't from the great and good families.
Men like Cromwell owe everything to Henry's readiness to put them in place. So they really suit Henry because they're going to be loyal to him.
Henry is really drawn to Cromwell. He's got a cheeky sense of humour. He's not afraid of Henry. And as a natural bully, Henry is actually rather disarmed by that.
He was ruthless, ambitious, and quite happy to tread on anyone who got in his way.
Cromwell seizes the opportunity to win favour and hatches a plan to make Henry rich. He's worked out that England's monasteries possess millions of pounds in untapped wealth.
Thomas Cromwell said, I'm going to make you rich, I'm going to dissolve all these monasteries, and it's all going to go straight into your pocket. Kings are always short of money, and that was music to Henry's ears.
Henry wanted to be the richest king in Christendom. It's all about his image for Henry. He wants to have the most magnificent court, to put one over on his rivals, such as the King of France.
I'm not sure Henry's greedy. I think that Henry feels that as king, it is his right to be in charge of everything.
To justify this money-making scheme, Henry and Cromwell start a slanderous propaganda campaign against England's Catholic monasteries.
If you're going to dissolve the monasteries, you have to have an excuse to do it. So Cromwell and his agents go around, they start drawing up lists of things that the monks and nuns are doing wrong.
Monasteries were always controversial places. These were houses of celibate men living on their own, often in remote, inaccessible places. Who knew what they were doing? Protestant reformers are saying not only are these places of idolatry, but they're places of sexual sin. They're sodomites, they're superstitious, they're monsters.
It's quite astonishing that the first piece of explicit legislation against sex between men comes in 1533, precisely in the context of this campaign. They find it useful to say, you know what's going on in these monasteries? All these monks are just buggering each other all day, all night. You know, this is why we need a crackdown. And so they use this not just to attack the monks, but to close down the institutions altogether. They say things have got so bad, they've all got to go.
Under Henry's orders, hundreds of monasteries across the English countryside are pillaged and destroyed.
Henry closed in the region of 563 monasteries. That's an enormous amount. These buildings had dominated the English landscape for centuries. They were almost like the social services of their day, fulfilling the role of hospitals, a charitable function. And so, of course, their loss had a huge impact on Henry's people.
There's one report that suggests there's 20,000 monks and nuns wandering around the country homeless. That just gives you an indication of how much of a shake-up of society this was.
Henry had pledged that all of the income from these religious houses would be invested in creating new, reformed religious establishments. He didn't keep his promise. He gave away a lot of the riches, a lot of the lands to his nobles, and he kept an awful lot for himself.
25 years into his reign, Henry has come close to destroying the Catholic Church in England and made a fortune in the process. But remarkably, in private, he's still clinging on to the traditional Catholic beliefs that he grew up with.
There's a real contradiction in Henry's attitude towards the religious changes. While in public, he's outlawing all sorts of things, such as going to Mass. In private, that's exactly what he's doing.
The Catholic Mass is at the heart of Henry's religious beliefs and really at the centre of his life, and he attends Mass every single day.
We know he crept on his knees to the cross at Easter. These are, in the views of most Protestants, superstition. But Henry was convinced they weren't. Superstition were the things the other people did. These things were true belief because in his heart he was performing them in the right way.
There is an enormous double standard with Henry. It's all very well for him to continue worshipping as he likes, but his people have to toe a different line. They have to be part of the new reformed religion.
But Henry's religious hypocrisy is testing some of his closest friendships. To people like Thomas More.
Thomas More's relationship with Henry VIII was as close to a friendship as a Tudor king could have. They argued long into the night. They talked about the latest works of philosophy and religion. They went up on the leads of the palaces and looked at the stars and talked about astronomy.
They'd first met when Henry was just 8 years old, so More was a huge influence on Henry, and he rose and rose in Henry's service. He was Lord Chancellor of all England by the 1530s.
But Thomas More was acutely religious, devout to the point of wearing a hair shirt under his clothes so that his flesh was mortified by the irritant. He would beat himself with a whip. I mean, these were the kind of extreme religious practices that the most reclusive Catholics would use.
As a devout Catholic, Thomas More disagrees strongly with Henry's decision to break with the Roman Catholic Church. And he's not the only one. Growing numbers of people are speaking out against Henry's new regime. These voices of dissent play heavily on Henry's insecurities.
Some outspoken priests in Middlesex said that Henry's private life resembled a pig wallowing and defiling itself. A nun makes these prophecies saying that she's seen a place reserved for him in hell. For Henry, this is all deeply personal. Anyone who speaks out against his reforms is criticising himself, and he can't take that.
Like his father before him, Henry VIII comes down on opponents with murderous force.
Hidden away in the Houses of Parliament is evidence of just how murderous Henry is becoming.
Here I am in the Parliamentary Archives looking at the 1534 Treason Act, one of the most extraordinary documents in Henry's reign. Here are Henry's neuroses, Henry's fears, Henry's insecurities, written in black and white. The 1534 Treason Act says it's now high treason to maliciously wish, will or desire, by words or writing, or by craft imagine, an attempt bodily harm against the king or the queen or their heirs apparent. This document says that it's now high treason to maliciously publish and pronounce by express writing or words that the king is a heretic, schismatic, tyrant, infidel, or usurper of the crown. The act is extraordinary because it's not only governing how people behave, but it's governing how they think and what they say. Henry VIII believed that as far as his subjects were concerned, you're either with him or against him. And if you were against him, you paid for it. This document changed Henry's realm into a land of fear. Words spoken in jest or in drink or in anger could lead you to the scaffold.
This brutal act significantly widens the scope of treason, and it marks a turning point in Henry's reign.
That need not only to have people obedient, but to believe absolutely in the justice of what he was doing was unprecedented. No one had asked this before. That is intruding into everyone's belief system, into their consciences, in a way that no one had tried before or since.
One of the first victims of Henry's ruthless new regime is his old friend Thomas More. Henry locks him in the Tower of London because More refuses to endorse his religious reforms.
More is very much a devout Catholic, and that idea of England breaking completely away and defying the Pope, defying tenets of Catholic faith, is not something that More can really live with.
More remains in the Tower for a year, and during that year, Henry does everything he possibly can to persuade him. He even says to him, believe what you like in your heart, so long as in public you're with me.
I think Henry still had that deep-felt conviction that eventually their friendship would prevail and that more would be won over by the sheer weight of argument and the force of Henry's personality.
Tudor history is full of these moments where people who have been working together for months and years suddenly fall apart. But I think it's particularly traumatic when it comes to Henry and Thomas More because of that deeper intellectual connection that the two of them had forged.
Eventually, Henry has had enough, and he authorizes his former friend's death. The Parliamentary Archives still holds the document that sanctions Thomas More's execution.
This document says that Thomas More is guilty of high treason by sowing sedition, by obstinately, contemptuously refusing to take the oath supporting the succession to the crown. They are powerful words. And later on, they describe the ingratitude of Thomas More towards the king. It lays down Thomas More's crimes and legalizes his execution. To all intents and purposes, it's his death warrant.
On the 6th of July, 1535, Thomas More is executed on Tower Hill.
I can't help but wonder whether Henry just had those moments where he looked at himself in the mirror and thought, how on earth have I come to this? Here he is, ordering the execution of some of his closest friends and advisors. He's caused turmoil in his kingdom. Did he ever bring any of that back on himself and actually examine his own motives, his own character?
I don't think Henry had a conscience about what he was doing. No, he's not a man who's going to lose any sleep over things like that. He has an objective which he wants to achieve, the continuation of the Tudor dynasty, and nothing or no one is going to stand in his way.
He absolutely believed in the righteousness of his own conclusions, and that's what drove him through.
There's definitely a sense at this point in Henry's reign that it's almost gathering a momentum of its own. There's no stopping Henry now, and it's going to get more and more brutal.
Little does Henry know that a freak accident is about to alter the future of his kingdom and the fate of his second wife. Henry VIII is now 44 years old, and his break with the Roman Catholic Church is beginning to tarnish his reputation. He's desperate to project the image of a king at the height of his powers.
In the middle of the 1530s, Henry was a man increasingly obsessed by his public image. He would spend many hours getting dressed by his men, covering up all those signs of weakness and projecting this idea that here is the most magnificent king ever to sit on the throne of England.
Henry, from the beginning, is very conscious of the importance of the public eye, but also he really enjoys it. He loves performing to people. Being the monarch, you have to look the part, and Henry is particularly adept at this. He's really interested in fashion. So we have records of Henry spending really huge amounts of money on cloth of gold, and he buys about 175 pairs of shoes in one single 12-month period. Henry is the ultimate investor in, dare I say, bling jewelry.
But beneath the royal clothing is a king who is far more vulnerable than he looks. Concerned he's losing the love and respect of his people, Henry's propaganda machine goes into overdrive.
Having broken with Rome, it was really important for Henry to win some hearts and minds if he's going to avoid a big rebellion. It involves a certain amount of PR effort using print, which is a pretty new technology, to produce lots of pamphlets and trying to win back some of that popular support.
It's not easy to get a country to break away from a faith that it had as a part of its way of life for centuries beforehand. So that trauma of separating from the Catholic Church is something that Henry has to respond to directly.
Whilst Henry hopes to escape public unrest, he can't seem to avoid it in private.
Henry develops an increasingly bad temper because he's losing patience with Anne and with this marriage, and also the fact that he hasn't yet to produce a male heir, and so he just now wants results.
Henry needs God to show him that he approves of his actions by giving him a son. And yet Anne does not produce a son. She has miscarriages. She has a daughter. It's as if his first marriage is just repeating itself. And that worries him. What's wrong about this marriage? Is this marriage cursed as well?
As time went by, there were more reasons for them to dispute and argue with each other. Her inability to produce the male heir was the grumbling resentment, but also her commitment to religious reform, her willingness to argue with Henry. These things were things that, over time, became more annoying than attractive.
The real turning point for Henry is when Anne accuses him in public of having an affair behind her back, and Henry is angered that she would dare question him in public about his behaviour. Henry responds to Anne by telling her that she needs to turn a blind eye to this behaviour as her betters had done, meaning Catherine of Aragon, and that he could unmake her just as quickly as he had raised her.
There's another person causing trouble inside the royal marriage. Henry's advisor, Thomas Cromwell.
Henry's court has become like a pressure cooker. So at the centre of this, we have Cromwell and Anne, who are each other's rivals and enemies. Anne has her own faction behind her, and Cromwell has his supporters. And we see in the court these two rival factions fighting for Henry's attention.
Cromwell knew that Anne Boleyn was intent on having his head. So he was very keen to act against her, to strike first before he was attacked himself.
Anne has an ace up her sleeve that she thinks will secure her position. She's pregnant. However, something is about to happen that will shake both Anne and Henry to the core. When Henry takes part in a jousting tournament, he falls from his horse. An account from the time reveals that the accident is so serious that Henry is knocked unconscious.
There's a report by Dr. Pedro Ortiz, who is the imperial Spanish ambassador to the Vatican. He's picked up some gossip coming in from Francis I of France, who's no friend of Henry VIII. The French king had said that the King of England had fallen from his horse and had been for 2 hours without speaking. So here we have Henry lying on the ground, not speaking for 2 hours. I believe that horse rolled on him, it crushed him. He suffered some kind of traumatic brain injury. Recent research has demonstrated that such an injury can actually cause neuroendocrinal damage. People suffering from this very rare disorder become depressed, irritable, and very suspicious of everyone around them. In the latter years of Henry's reign, he was displaying all those symptoms.
Henry's accident also has a dramatic effect on his wife, Anne Boleyn.
What is absolutely certain is the shock of hearing that Henry had this accident caused Anne Boleyn to miscarry a male child. Queen Anne was brought to bed and delivered of a man-child before her time. It was said she took a fright. It was a 3-month-old fetus, male child, perfectly formed. And if the child had lived, it could have been Henry's longed-for male heir.
The miscarriage is a personal disaster for Anne, because that possibility that the male heir was finally at last about to appear is taken away again, and she's damaged goods.
After his accident, Henry becomes increasingly paranoid. And at court, things are now more dangerous for Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell.
There is a diplomatic letter which describes the English court as a nest of hissing snakes. There are eavesdroppers at every corner. Absolutely nobody is safe, from the Queen to the greatest statesman of the country.
Around Easter 1536, we see a real shift now between the relationship of Cromwell and Henry. Henry calls out Cromwell in front of the whole court, publicly disgraces him, and this now puts Anne back on the chessboard, and so she's removed Cromwell, her rival, and once again she's the centre of Henry's world.
Cromwell storms out, and the first thing he does is to start plotting to get rid of Anne.
Cromwell has decided it's Anne or him, and it's going to be Anne.
Secretly, Thomas Cromwell launches an investigation into Anne's behaviour.
As soon as he's left court, Cromwell puts the word out that he's sick. But Cromwell is far from sick. He is using this 2-week absence as the perfect cover for him to start plotting the downfall of his archenemy, Anne Boleyn. Cromwell has this incredibly sophisticated network of spies and informants. Among his network are a number of ladies from the Queen's own household. Now, Anne isn't popular with her ladies. She's a fairly cruel mistress, so you might imagine how willing those ladies are to give Cromwell little tidbits of gossip, information that he can slowly craft into a case.
One of the things about the early modern court is that it is based upon flirtation, and it's based upon the language of courtship. So at any point, those acts which could have been perfectly normal are reinterpretable as much more culpable. If you say you love the Queen, what do you mean? Cromwell began to find a lot of evidence of people saying inappropriate things.
Just 2 weeks later, Cromwell presents his findings to Henry.
When Cromwell had to go and tell Henry what he'd discovered, it must have been the most terrifying moment of his political career. To say that the king's wife, his queen, was adulterous, I mean, that's not news you can slip in a list of other things as you're going through the morning's business.
Cromwell's evidence accuses Anne of conducting an affair behind her husband's back with not one, but 5 men, including her own brother.
To be the King of England and to be told that your queen is betraying you sexually is not something that you can lightly brush off. He had to take control of that, and he took control of it with a ruthless passion, a rage that meant that it had to be driven through, that there was no escape. This is a man not in denial, but in manic acceptance of the charge. And I think that's what drives the process from there on in.
When he wanted something to be true, it became true. And this was absolutely the case now with his second wife's infidelity, because her real failure, let's be honest about it, was not giving Henry a son. That was the only way she'd let him down. I don't believe she was guilty for one moment of anything else. But Henry needed her out. And of course, this was all too convenient.
In the archives of the British Library is a letter that provides a glimpse into Henry's mind during this time, as well as the man manipulating him, Thomas Cromwell.
This is a letter by Thomas Cromwell written in May 1536, at the height of the controversy surrounding Anne Boleyn. This letter is undoubtedly one of our best sources for understanding Henry's perspective on Anne Boleyn. Cromwell says here, "The King's Highness thought convenient that I should advertise you of the same. I should tell you about what's been going on, about the case against Anne. Really, what he's saying is the king has instructed Cromwell to spread the word about Anne Boleyn's crimes, and they are all described here in their full gory detail. This bit here reads, "Her crimes were so abominable that I think the like was never heard." And there's some fairly graphic language used here to describe the Queen's incontinent living. This is written for an absolute purpose. It's telling the world Anne Boleyn is guilty of heinous crimes. Anne is the most wicked queen in history, according to Cromwell.
Alongside charges of adultery, Cromwell's letter also accuses Anne of plotting Henry's death.
At the bottom we have here talk of a certain conspiracy against the king. So in Henry's mind, it goes beyond just adultery, an unfaithful wife. She's plotting treason. This is a pure piece of PR on Cromwell's part. Cromwell manipulated Henry, and in fact, he later boasted that he had dreamt up the whole scheme against Anne Boleyn.
Whatever the truth behind the accusations, Henry falls for them, hook, line, and sinker.
Once convinced that there was a kernel of truth to it, Henry's imagination knew no bounds, and at one point famously he said, well, maybe it's 1,000 men. Who knows what Anne is capable of?
Henry VIII is a great fan of good stories. He's good at spinning them, and he is also taken in by them. And the story that is spun around Anne is the one of the wicked woman, a woman with an insatiable desire to manipulate men.
Henry orders Anne's arrest, and she is escorted to the Tower of London. He will never see her again. As Anne Boleyn awaits her trial in the Tower of London, reports suggest that Henry VIII is becoming mentally imbalanced.
The Spanish ambassador reported that Henry had collapsed in tears about Anne Boleyn's downfall.
Henry VIII was always an extraordinarily emotional man. Tears were never far from the surface. Tears of joy, tears of grief. But of course, Henry always cries only for one person, and that person is Henry himself.
For Tudor men, not being able to control your wife is really seen as the cardinal sin and the biggest flaw against your masculinity.
I'm sure that Henry did believe Anne was guilty because it was convenient for him to believe that Anne was guilty. And it made him right. He was the good person, she was the bad person.
While Anne is under lock and key, the investigation into her infidelities ramps up.
This letter was written by Sir William Kingston, who was Anne's jailer at the Tower. And Kingston had been set upon Anne as a spy by Henry. Henry wanted to know her every move, her every word. Kingston reports this overheard conversation between Anne and Henry. Norris was actually one of the gentlemen who served the king, but he was also a great favourite with Anne and stood accused of adultery with her. Anne asks Norris why he would tarry before getting married. Why is he waiting to get married? And she says the following throwaway remark, "Did he look for dead men's shoes?" Effectively, she's kind of teasing Norris, saying, are you waiting for the king to die so that you can marry me? The fact that such a throwaway remark, harmless in itself, was enough to condemn a Queen of England shows you just how febrile the atmosphere was at Henry's court. The king himself was growing increasingly paranoid. He's starting to lose his grip on reality. And that is all reflected here in this piece of evidence against Anne.
Based on this evidence, Anne is tried for treason and quickly found guilty, as are the 5 men accused of sleeping with her. Henry does not attend Anne's trial, but he is heavily involved in the plans for her execution.
So Henry spends hours poring over the details of the scaffold, how exactly she is going to die. And he decides that he's going to have her beheaded with a sword rather than with the traditional axe. The only woman in English history ever to be beheaded this way. People have suggested that this was because she was raised in France and that he was being kindly and thinking, you know, oh, this will be a lovely reminder of her childhood to get her head chopped off with a sword rather than an axe, or it was more dignified. I don't think that's true at all. I think Henry was thinking about Henry, not about Anne.
He wanted the theatre of punishment to be perfect. He wanted the execution to be exemplary. This is what happens when you defy Henry. This is what traitors get.
Henry didn't ever like to associate himself with death. He wouldn't go to funerals. He wouldn't be anywhere near anyone who was mortally sick. And he didn't want to be seen in the same space as Anne Boleyn ever again. Her name was not to be mentioned. All trace of her was removed from his palaces. So, of course, he's going to be nowhere near the Tower that day. But he invited 1,000 people to watch Anne Boleyn's head being struck off. Those are the actions of a madman.
On the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn is executed. But Henry has already lined up his next wife.
The speed with which Henry moves on to wife number 3, Jane Seymour, is deeply disturbing, really. The very next day, they are betrothed. They're married 10 days later. Now, that is fast, even by Henry's standards.
He needs to get cracking because, you know, he needs to have a son and he needs to live long enough for that son to grow to adulthood. So he's not going to waste time, you know, pretending to mourn a woman who's betrayed him.
The following year, Jane Seymour is able to give him what his 2 previous wives have not: a healthy son and heir to the throne. Tragically, Jane herself dies only 2 weeks after the birth, leaving Henry once more alone. But his reign is far from over.
The England of the late 1530s is entirely different from the England of a decade before. We've got the monasteries being dissolved. We've got a dramatic change of personnel at court. All sorts of people have disappeared. Thomas More is gone. Anne Boleyn has gone. Jane Seymour has gone. Henry himself has got older. He's got more tyrannical. His reign has got bloodier, and he is more determined than ever to get his own way.
In the next episode, age and infirmity start to catch up with Henry VIII.
The pain that Henry got from his leg was absolutely huge. When the leg was really bad, he could turn black in the face and just sort of lie still, hardly able to speak.
And he turns on his closest advisor.
Those less admirable traits that we'd seen hints of early in his life are now front and centre. This is Henry as a tyrant. This is the beginning of a totalitarian state.